Welcome to the Young Wealth Show, where you'll truly learn how to make, spend, and invest money for an awesome life. Get the real-life stuff that wasn't part of your school curriculum. Young Wealth gives you innovative new ways of dealing with your finances, as well as the skills and tools you're going to need to survive and be successful out on your own. Let the Young Wealth Show be your GPS to take you from clueless to clued in. Here is your host, Jason Hartman, with Young Wealth.
Thank you for joining me for another edition of the Young Wealth Show. This is Jason Hartman, and this is episode number 6. You can visit our website, of course, at youngwealth.com or jasonhartmanfoundation.org. On this show, what I'd like to do is interview one of my listeners from my for-profit show, which is called the Creating Wealth Show. He's been a longtime listener and just has some great insights on what it takes to get ahead as a young person and to start out right in life. He sent me a bunch of Zimbabwe dollars. And when I reference Zimbabwe, the important thing to understand about that is Zimbabwe is sort of the poster child of a country that can't manage its money. And in the show, in future shows, we'll talk a lot about monetary policy and how the government creates money out of thin air and what that means to our savings, our stocks, our bonds, our investments, our real estate, and all the stuff that we either own now or we might own in the future. So inflation and monetary policy is a very, very important concept to understand. Most people go through their whole life and they never understand this at all. Many people go through their whole life and they don't understand it till they're 30, 40, 50, 60 years old. So it's really important to get a handle on this early in life because it will really influence the decisions you make about whether to spend money, how to spend it, and whether to save money and how to save it, and whether or not to invest money, and of course, how to invest it. Anyway, let's go to the interview and give you some insights on a young person who is really getting it and understanding the big scam that's really being portrayed at the highest levels of our monetary system all around the world. Here's the interview. It's my pleasure to welcome one of my longtime listeners to the show here today, and that is Damien Bourke, who's coming to us from Ireland and just has some fascinating perspectives to share with us today. Damien, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jason. Great to be here.
It's great to have you on. Tell us, first of all, in Ireland, you're coming to us from Ireland today. Where in Ireland?
I'm coming from the south of Ireland. It'd be maybe 100 miles away south of Dublin. So it's a pretty small town called Waterford. It's between Cork and Dublin for any of your listeners who might know Ireland.
Fantastic. Well, certainly love your accent. It's fantastic. So let's get down to it. First of all, maybe tell the listeners, Damien, you're 24 years old and you are jumping on the areas of business and real estate investing because you don't want to be dependent on somebody else and you don't see yourself as being an employee for the rest of your life, right?
No, absolutely right, Jason. I guess I've been listening to, your Creating Wealth show for well over 2.5 years at this stage. I think I remember my very first episode of listening was, I think, episode number 19. And pretty much since then I've been, hooked to the shows that you publish each week. So I had to say, first of all, a very big thank you to the great effort that you're doing. I've learned so much in that space of time, and I've avoided, I guess, so many mistakes that I probably would have made in my 20s and 30s had I not got hold of your educational podcast. And, you've really helped shape my thinking at such a young age. And part of that is not being an employee all my life. I want to have the ability, and I believe I do have the ability, to create my own wealth.
And create your own destiny. That's fantastic. And
Absolutely.
Damien, when I hear stuff like what you just said, first of all, thank you. And that makes it all worthwhile for me to do that, because if we can keep you from making the mistakes, so many people, they usually don't wake up until they're about 40, 45 years old financially. I think that's, at least in the States, when people they kind of wake up and realize the government's not going to be there for me. I have no real job security. I've got to make my own way in the world. And the sooner people realize that, the better off they will be, right?
I couldn't agree with you more, Jason. And I guess over this side of the world, people don't tend to wake up until they're a little bit older. So, I'm just so glad I was able to, get my head tuned in to what I really want to do and how I want to achieve it. Again, at a young age. I started listening to you at 21 years of age. So I'm just really, really grateful, as I said, to have that opportunity to be able to, hit my 20s now with that frame of mind.
Well, what is it that you've learned? I mean, maybe more specifically, what is it you want to do? And maybe tell the listeners, first of all, what your background is. You're in the accounting world, right?
Yeah, gone into my second year as an accountant at this stage now. I've gone through college with a degree, and I also got a master's. So I'm as I said, I'm a trainee accountant at the moment, and it's, a 3-year time span before I'm actually fully qualified. So I guess I've always had a very strong interest in financial areas, and an awful lot of financial advice that I would have, I suppose, got bombarded with from the media and from newspapers and from leading business magazines. It would have been, I wouldn't have agreed with it. And once I started listening to your Creating Wealth show, I couldn't have agreed with you more. You've dealt with so many great issues, such as, I suppose, your dominant business is real estate, but you diversify so much away from that. You talk about, say, the advantages and disadvantages of, say, stocks, bonds. You also deal with inflation. You talk about, I suppose, the U.S. economy, the world economy. And I guess at this age, I've kind of created my own fundamental attitude of how I want to approach my investments in the future. Your show, of course, it's very enjoyable. You have some excellent guests on your show each week. And the learning ability that we as listeners, and I'm sure as you as an interview, get from these guests, it's immense, and it's something that I'm very grateful, as I said, to get to be able to get this frame of mind so early. So my core investment strategy, I'm not an active investor as of yet, my core investment strategy, it would certainly mimic what you talk about in your shows each week, Jason.
Well, Damien, what is the sort of the perspective and the opportunities and challenges that a young person faces in today's world? And it's great to have you on from Ireland, because the perspective is very different when you look around the world. Everybody's been raised in a different culture. And tell us a little bit about that perspective out there and what you think the challenges young people face nowadays and the opportunities for them too.
Yeah, certainly. The challenges, I guess all challenges do have a degree of opportunity about them. But the challenges, I guess, I see anyway, from my own point of view, at the moment we're currently living in a time where so many people are coming into wealth in terms of emerging economies, bringing their populations into better lifestyles, e.g. China and India. So these people are going to be competing for jobs, they're going to be competing for resources, and that's going to be a challenge to my generation over the coming decades. There also seems to be maybe this term may be called a qualification inflation. And what I mean by that is that employers are no longer just seeking a degree from prospective interview candidates. They're also looking for perhaps a master's and even a PhD. So the benchmark is rising all the time in terms of, say, education and experience. Another challenge maybe people face is what advice to actually follow. You'd be surprised the amount of people who actually get financial qualifications, but they follow so much of this mainstream advice. Oftentimes we'd open a newspaper and you'd see the headline, "Be rich and retire by the time you're 50." And then you actually look at this advice and it's actually telling you to maybe invest in a 401k or invest in mutual funds. And that advice, it's so out of date, I guess. It's lazy and it's no way creative and adequate in today's world. So they would certainly be the main challenges. And so stemming on from that, young people, they need to maybe develop sound investment fundamentals. Like my generation would have lived now in a time, we've just seen the dot-com boom, we'd have seen then the real estate bubble, and of course the credit crunch at the moment. So we've got to be able to develop and practice some sound fundamentals that adopt, I suppose, an offensive and a defensive strategy, offensive to create wealth and defensive to actually protect our wealth. And one other point, I suppose, a big challenge I would see for young people, I guess, is the way the governments, they're all over the world really, they're writing stimulus checks and bailouts and basically on the backs of younger generations and even generations that aren't even born yet. So I personally take maybe a worst case scenario, I guess, to be less reliant on government aid as I get older, be less reliant on, say, social welfare, be less reliant on government healthcare, because perhaps in the future governments won't be able to provide this healthcare and welfare and pensions for their citizens. So that's something I'd be very conscious of
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, Damien. And you know, I just tell you, one of my friends on Facebook, she put a funny little one of those sort of sandwich board signs over her very young daughter, who's maybe, I don't know, 3 years old or something like that. And the sign said, "Thank you, Mr. President. I'm already $38,000 in debt." And, you know, well, that's kind of funny and cute, but it's really sad. And we have saddled the younger generation with so many obligations that simply they cannot pay. And
it's no different in Ireland, and I can assure you it's no different in Europe.
Well, yeah, I'm going to ask you about that in a moment, because Europe definitely leans more socialist than the U.S., although lately I'm not so sure. You know, in the U.S., it's we're going your direction. But what's interesting about that, too, is that sign she put over her daughter that said $38,000 in debt was wholly inaccurate, though. It's much worse than that, because in the States, when you take into account the contingent liabilities, depending on which way you look at it, that kid is almost $200,000 in debt. So there is no way. Everybody listening, you've got to understand there is no possible way governments around the world, and it's not just in the U.S., will be able to fulfill these obligations. I mean, it's simply impossible. They may keep the promise in nominal dollars, but the real value of those dollars will be so much lower, and it is critically important that people like you, Damien, at your age, must catch on to this early, because the time starts to work so much in your favor. Just the simple fact of the compounding benefits of investments and businesses started early, it just changes everything, doesn't it?
It definitely does. I suppose I've dealt with some of the challenges, so maybe to get the doom and gloom out of the way, I would be a pretty optimistic guy at the same time. We're living in a world that I see, in my opinion anyway, that people, our generation, have never had as many opportunities. You know, it's an unprecedented time. We can communicate with anyone in the world. We can interact with so many people. And with like so many emerging economies coming to the fore, Jason, the amount of business opportunities that could arise over the coming decades, like who knows what's going to happen. There's excellent potential there. And add in perhaps new technologies that might also come to the fore. In my opinion, I see some very good opportunities, although there are challenges. Like we as a generation can overcome those challenges if we take the right steps at the right time and basically tune our mind in to follow the correct way of thinking.
No question about it. What's going on? I mean, give us a little bit of the global perspective. I mean, certainly European governments cannot fulfill these obligations that they have, right?
Well, it's very difficult to see that they can do that. I guess, as you may know, in the Eurozone, we're all tied to one currency. So whether or not the government or the governments will allow inflation to actually run out of control, to basically pay off this debt is another thing. So in that scenario, perhaps the quality of social welfare, our pensions, our healthcare will drop, rather than just the nominal amounts, as you said, being actually fulfilled.
When you see what's going on in the U.S. right now with the socialized healthcare people and all of this sort of government intervention, what do you think, being a European, when you see that going on over here? Do you think that's a good idea, or do you think it's a very bad idea?
It's hard for me to tell, because I guess in Europe we're a little bit more socialist than the United States. And it's hard for me, I suppose, to judge what the healthcare system was actually like and what it will be like in the future in the US, because I've never, got first-hand experience of it. Like on paper, it probably looks like a pretty bad deal, because, you see the Obama administration, what they've actually done since they've come to power. I guess they've really opened up the taps in terms of money flow anyway. So you need to question like the rationale also behind this healthcare system, and will it actually work? Is it just buying votes, or is there a long-term potential to it? I suppose the opinion coming from the States seems to be no, it won't work. But I guess I wouldn't have a too strong an opinion on it in that sense.
Give us a little perspective, if you would, Damien, on what happened with the economy in Ireland and the real estate market there. My perspective is that there were tax incentives offered, a lot of the tech companies established a presence there, and things really boomed for a while, and then ultimately created a bubble, right?
That's exactly it. Maybe around 1994, 95, things started getting really good, and it continued for well over a decade. Right now, at the moment, we're experiencing all the symptoms of the US. We're running large deficits. As you said, we're experiencing a housing bubble. And we also had maybe a decade of debt obesity, and young and old are guilty of that. We just did not use debt prudently. So as a result, we've had to bail out many of the banks, our construction industry, and our housing. There's basically an oversupply of it. I think one thing we also had, say, in Ireland that maybe in the States did not have as much was an actual development land boom and bust as well. We had people speculating on the prices of development land rather than just the housing. And now this development land, the value of it's dropped so dramatically. Many of these property developers are now bust, and they owe so much to banks. And the debt that they owe to the banks almost single-handedly brought down many of those institutions. As you said also at the start, that there was the Irish government, I suppose, incentivised multinational companies to come to Ireland in the early 90s to set up, their manufacturing base here. And it was a good idea at the time. We had a pretty good labour force. We had some nice tax incentives. But now those manufacturing companies seem to have moved on. They're going to, say, Eastern Europe, and they're also going to Far East. So we're also experiencing maybe an exodus of the manufacturing plants from Ireland as well. So, as I said, we're experiencing many of the problems that you in the States are also experiencing. But I feel that our government are being more transparent in how they're dealing with it. We can't flood the markets with money due to our constrictions within the euro. So they seem to be, to some degree, proactively dealing with this debt insofar as they're trying to cut the deficit. They've set up a bad bank to deal with all these toxic loans, and they're attempting to trim some of the public sector costs.
What is the sort of outlook for the real estate market there?
To me personally, not good. If I take your investment fundamentals, say, for real estate, and if I was to apply them to the Irish market, barely any of those criteria will actually work. The Irish housing market is still so overinflated, and basically people would have bought houses with the idea to rent and just rely on the appreciation in value. Now, at the moment, we're a pretty small country, maybe 4.5 million population. At the moment, everyone's actually scared to touch the housing market. And I've often heard you say maybe in the United States it's made up of a couple of hundred different real estate regions, but in Ireland it's really just one big region, and that region is pretty toxic at the moment. So my outlook for real estate in Ireland, it's not very attractive.
How about the rest of Europe? Because I tell you, Damien, you probably heard the show I did when I traveled to Eastern Europe about a year and a half ago. And I went to Estonia, Latvia, Romania, Bulgaria, and I was in Germany, of course, too. And I just couldn't make anything pencil there. Now, I realized that some of those markets were really near the peak of a bubble, which, by the way, for the listeners' benefit, did burst and prices really dropped. But it's very expensive over there. It's not, people think it's expensive in America. I think our real estate market in the right markets in the southeastern United States and a few areas in the southwest desert areas is pretty darn inexpensive. You can get a much better deal on a property in Dallas, Atlanta, Austin, or Phoenix than you can pretty much in any European major city that I know of.
I certainly agree with you there, because I've often compared, say, real estate prices in the United States compared to, first of all, Ireland, second of all, Europe. And the price difference, it's amazing. In perhaps if you went back a decade ago or maybe a little bit longer, the Irish real estate market, it was pretty okay. It was maybe not very liquid, not very active, but the prices were reasonable. Likewise with the Eastern European countries. But once they've got closer to the European community, we've basically seen a bubble frenzy there as well. And, many people often say if you see a taxi driver talking about buying properties in Eastern Europe, then there's a bubble, and then it's the time to sell.
That's the old saying. It's I think it was John D. Rockefeller or something right before the Great Depression. He said, when the shoeshine boy is talking to me about investing, you're in a bubble because it's become too contagious. Yeah, good point. So what is the sort of outlook as to how you think America is handling its bubble bust? I mean, you touched on some of that already. Is there any other thoughts on that? The money printing that is going on here, the prospects for inflation or deflation?
Yeah, it's difficult to tell, first of all, how they're handling their bubble burst. It appears that this concept of, I suppose, moral hazard it's really struck a note in America insofar as people are able to modify their loans. And maybe, okay, it's a good thing at the moment, it's, in the short term, but over the long term that cannot be good, especially for a generation who will become accustomed to that kind of practice. Granted, some of the practices that went on in America in certain regions were crazy. We'd read about them here in Europe, and I suppose we experienced them as well in Europe. But the United States seems to be the forefront of just malpractice. And it's interesting to see how will the next generation, I guess, the up-and-coming generation actually view real estate. Will they see real estate as an attractive opportunity? And will the whole bubble start again? Who knows? Regarding inflation, I guess a lot of us over this side of the world we're of the opinion that a bout of inflation is probably going to hit the States pretty soon. Whether or not it'll actually hit the Eurozone remains to be seen because they're slightly more inflation conscious. So I guess from my own perspective, and I guess Ireland's perspective, we need to be very concerned about the US inflation. We're a very open economy. We export very much so to the United States, and as well as that, countries who are dependent and maybe tied to the US currency. So if inflation does set in the United States, it can really hurt us over here as well.
Well, Damien, I want to first of all congratulate you and just tell you how great it is to see that you are seriously interested in all of this stuff at such a young age. You've got a big head start over your peers, and I hope more will be more focused on this kind of thing. What do you want young people to know in closing?
Well, I guess I would highly, highly recommend them to basically download all your shows and listen through them. There's an excellent wealth and library of information there. But I guess my best advice to any young person, being a young person myself, is to get educated, work hard, acquire skills that are demanded, and, invest your money prudently. Don't take on, silly, needless debt. And as I said, I focus on some of the opportunities that we as a generation have. So go where the opportunities are. And, just speak your mind and value your freedom.
Yeah, hey, that's great advice. I like everything you said there. That's fantastic. Well, Damien Bourke, thank you so much for talking to us from Ireland today. What time is it there, by the way?
It's going just past 11 o'clock.
11 o'clock. Thank you for staying up late with us, too. We could have done this a little earlier for your benefit, but I appreciate you staying up so late to talk to us. Thanks so much for being on the show.
You're welcome, Jason. Thanks very much.
Copyright the Hartman Media Company. For publication rights and interviews, please email media@jasonhartman.com. This show offers very general information concerning real estate for investment purposes. Opinions of guests are their own. Jason Hartman is acting as president of Platinum Properties Investor Network exclusively. Nothing contained herein should be considered personalized, personal, financial, investment, legal, or tax advice. Every investor's strategy and goals are unique. You should consult with a licensed real estate broker or agent or other licensed investment, tax, and/or legal advisor before relying on any information contained herein. Information is not guaranteed. Please call 714-820-4200 and visit www.jasonhartman.com for additional disclaimers, disclosures, and questions.